Welcome through this teleconference session for Postgraduate Diploma in Journalism and Mass Communication, PGJMC. Today we will be discussing sources of news for a media organization and source of news of a journalist also. And we have Professor Shivai Sarkar of IIMC with us to discuss this subject. Students are welcome to ask their questions which are relevant to our syllabus. Professor Sarkar, welcome to this session. And just briefly tell us, our students, that what are the major sources of news for a media organization?
You see, basically first let us discuss why we need sources. You see, journalism is one profession which does not merely deal with news, because if it is news, it has to have some origination. And how it is being originated, and that is exactly the source. That is where the journalist has to find from where it is coming out, and that is simply is called a source. That means for every news item, whatever we are getting, there has to be a particular originating point from where we get that news and then we disseminate it. The journalist is basically a conduit between someone who is having the news. He takes it and then he gives it back to the public. So that is what the source is. That means he is trying to find out from where he is getting the basic news. That is exactly the sources. And now that is one way the journalist does. But if you get into the ambit of entire news media,
News organization, yes.
News organizations, news agencies, newspapers, they have a number of sources, because news is pouring in from all over the world, from all over the country, even if it is a city, from all over the city also. Now, there is one problem, because news operations is so large, no newspaper or news organization can reach all the levels, all the corners of, say, country, city or the globe. So, they have to depend on a variety of sources. And just let us start for news organizations, how they deal with it. You see, simply everybody knows the news agencies like the Press Trust of India, United News of India, Reuters, Associated Press, AFP, all these are global news operations from which number of news stories every day pour in, every newspapers, everywhere. So news agencies is one of the most important area of getting the news.
So news organization cannot afford to have correspondent all over the country or across the world. So they have to depend on news agencies.
Absolutely. You are very right. No news organization can dedicate their own staffers all over the world, because that's a massive operation and a very expensive operation also. And besides, normally a news organizations concentrates on the area where they have a circulation or viewership. Beyond that, investment becomes slightly inaccurate, or also you can say a waste. So to minimize the costs and also to increase the ambit of news gathering, they depend on news
agencies. So generally they have their news gathering network where they have major concentration of their readers or viewers. That's the point.
Yes.
Now, for example, in Daily Times of India will have their own correspondent stingers in the area where newspaper is dead.
Yes, absolutely. Not only Times of India or any other organization.
Any other newspaper, for example.
If it is same, if you take a Hindi newspaper, say it is a Amar Ujala, and it is having concentrating in an area, say a small town called Muzaffarnagar. So the operation will get very micro
yes.
and confined to that area. So in that case, they have to source news from that particular area, and if they have a network, well, they can do it on their own. But if they don't have, they will have to depend on news agencies.
So that's one major source of a news organization is news agencies.
Absolutely,
that's one. And what are the other sources for it?
Other sources, of course, quite often it seems very interesting. The radio and television news, that also becomes a source, because in fact every newspaper becomes a source for somebody
for
from
other
newspaper or news organization. Radio news or television news, because they are getting news from across the world, and so quite often that particular input may not be available with the particular newspaper or news organization. So they have to depend on someone who is giving it, and that is one important source. It becomes radio news. International radios also. It is just not the national radio, international radios, international televisions, and quite often you can see even the television channels when there was this 9/11 incident in New York. No Indian news channel or newspaper had access to what was exactly happening in New York. They were depending on the clips that were being telecast by different news, international news channels, and particularly US news channels like the Fox News or the CNN, and then they were trying to show it, of course, with courtesy, mentioning that they have taken it from them. So this is another source.
So another major source is the media organizations themselves.
Media organizations themselves, and that includes also magazines and newspapers.
Yes, number of times we see the news reports quoting New York Times or Washington
Especially
Post.
you see, quite often if you look at foreign correspondents. Now foreign correspondents for any newspaper or news organization would be 1 or 2 persons, and the bureau would be very small. Now quite often they depend on the local news agencies and newspapers and magazines to source their news. So this is another way they do it.
Obviously, when one newspaper is having only one correspondent in Washington, one correspondent cannot cover the entire American administration. So they have to depend on American news organizations.
American news organizations. Then we have the state governments press releases, press bureaus, then central government press information bureau, private organizations press releases. They are also important sources of news.
So large number of press releases and handouts they pour in the news organizations.
Pour in the news organizations, that is. Then you have also the various reference books. Many things suddenly is happening and you exactly do not know what is happening, how it is happening or where it is happening. Then you refer to the reference books.
For background information.
Like encyclopedia and other similar materials. You have embassies. For various, recently the way this Tibetan incidents that happened during this Olympic torch march, you had to depend a lot on the Chinese embassy to source the news. Similarly, there are many operations like that where you have to depend on embassies. Now, US embassy has been a continuous source of news to discuss this nuclear deal. The police, they are important sources of news because whatever is happening, it has to be registered with the police, and that is where you get the authenticity of the news also. The source also adds to the authenticity. Because without authenticating, nothing can either be telecast, broadcast, or even put in print. So you have to have an authenticated source, and all these, whatever have been mentioned so far, they authenticate the news source. Then we have courts. Many things are happening, because once it has gone beyond the approach of the police, then it goes to the courts.
So one is, that means when we talk about news organizations, then there are 3 major categories of the sources. First are the news agencies, which are the sources for news organizations.
Absolutely.
Second category is the news organizations themselves.
Yes.
There are large number of news organizations, that one news organization depending on the news report of some other news organizations.
Absolutely.
And third category is press releases, handouts that poured in newspaper offices.
Yes.
And then Professor Sarkar is explaining that there are then sources which are sources for a journalist, for a reporter, a correspondent.
Now, besides, I think because this requires a slightly more elaboration, so I would just tell in brief how this news organizations get the news. You see, there are also tribunals and committees, various tribunals, various committees. They give various kinds of recommendations. So that also becomes an important news source. Then we have parliament assemblies. What you see, parliament and assemblies are virtually gold mine of information. Everything that you want to know every day, thousands of questions are asked and thousands of questions are answered. So all those questions, all those answers, they become an important input not only for the day's news, but sometimes they also provide important source for the backgrounder. So for future news operations also, we can depend on this parliament and assembly. Not only whatever the development that has taken place. Quite often people feel parliament and assembly means whatever has happened during the 0 hour, the dean, that is the news. That is not exactly. That is just the tip of the iceberg. Small operations which may be taking place maybe in 5 to 10 minutes of the entire Parliament's operations during the day. But beyond that, we have hospitals. You see, quite often people wonder how a journalist comes to know about who has met with an accident, who has met with death, who has been injured. And because people wonder how a journalist can be present everywhere. No, journalist does not go everywhere, but he definitely visits what is called the hospitals and the morgue, that is the mortuary, because whosoever will die an unnatural death has to be brought to the morgue, and in case of an accident or a casualty, he has to go to the emergency department of the hospital, the casualty department of the hospital. So these become important news sources not only for the newspapers but also for the journalists.
Police, hospitals,
Absolutely.
maybe fire brigades,
Absolutely.
that kind of sources.
Then academic institutions. Now people would wonder how academic institutions can be sources of news. Because academic institutions, people feel that they are one place where people go, learn their lessons and come out. But beyond that, they also do many things. They also do many studies, many research and many other things that are very new to the people, and news is something that is really new. So from academic institutions also, we have lots of stories, lots of news stories. So academic institutions becomes an important source of coverage for any news organization. Apart from that, there are of course the news organization's own resources like the staff reporters, the correspondents, the freelance writers, and apart from that, stringers. Quite often people do not understand what a stringer is. Normally a stringer means a person who is paid a small amount, that is called a string, with which maintains a relationship with the organization. Especially such persons are put at small places which is not an active news development place. From there, whenever something is happening, this man feeds the organization. So he is called a stringer.
So he's not a staffer, he's not an employee of the
not
company.
exactly a staffer, but almost functions like a staffer.
Yes, contributing whenever there is some event.
Absolutely.
So there are large amount of information that that are available from the parliamentary proceedings, and as Professor Sarkar explained that Parliament is not just walk-around and hangama that happens, but beyond that there are lot of proceedings and committee meetings and tribunals and so many other things. Academic institutions, tribunal reports, commissions reports that can make also news. They are the major sources of news for a news organization. Power breakdown. So should we move to the sources of a journalist?
Yeah.
And you also explained that a news organization has its own network of the correspondent.
Yeah.
That means spell correspondent, reporters, stingers,
Absolutely.
which are spread across the country and in more concentrated the area of their operations.
Yes.
Yes, please.
Apart from that, there is also feature syndicates. Quite
Feature
often people do
syndicates.
not understand what exactly a feature syndicate is. A feature syndicate is virtually like a news agency, but what they disseminate is articles of interest to various news organizations or newspapers. Quite often, smaller newspapers can't afford to pay to the columnists. So what they have to depend on these feature syndicates, and these feature syndicates circulate these articles to 100, 200 or as per their subscriber base to a number of newspapers or news organizations. Now there are also feature syndicates also for the television channels also. Now these feature syndicates, they circulate news clips to different television channels, and in fact internationally also they operate, and it becomes an important news gathering point, and interesting stories come out of these feature syndicates, especially for television. And sometimes now you can also find that they also send audio stories also for various kinds of radio also, as the radio is also expanding its operation. And then there is one more important thing, is the interviews. Now quite often people do not understand what exactly an interview is. Interview is virtually a tete-a-tete with a person. Now, any reader, any common man has a feeling that he need to talk to a particular source, particular person. Now, for a common man, it is not possible either to reach that person, but he has that eagerness to know how he must be talking, how he must be reacting, and that is what the interviews fill up. Interviews is virtually creating a kind of a scenario which bridges the distance between a reader or a viewer and the source. The source here virtually directly talks to the reader or viewer. So interviews create a kind of a situation where the entire operations becomes live. Especially if you remember the way these film personalities are interviewed every day on various channels, that is done basically to make those people who are interested in, to give them a hands-down experience with these persons. Not only that, with politicians also we do it. With other interesting persons, like as today it has happened, and this ISRO has launched the satellites, 10 satellites in one go. So, all the scientists in the ISRO, they can be interviewed. The chairman of the ISRO can be interviewed to give a first-hand feeling to the news operations, to the news readers, how it is happening.
Directly from the source.
Directly from the source to the viewer.
To the viewers. All. So should we move to now sources of a journalist?
Oh, sure, we have to do that.
What are the sources for a journalist? Because we have been discussing the sources for a media organizations. Now comes the next step, that what are the sources of news for journalists, which is very crucial and critical, I think, in all kind of media operations.
Absolutely. You see, this is a very critical part, because what we have so far
the entire
discussed,
journalism is dependent on the sources. That's how you deal with the sources.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Because whatever so far we have discussed, these are the basic way a news organization generate their news. But that can't be the be all and end of it, because a journalist is employed by a news organization to create a kind of a exclusivity for the news organization. And these, all the sources that the news organizations depend on, they can't be said to depend or create that exclusivity. But a journalist is employed so that the news organization looks different from all other organizations. So this is where the source becomes very important, and quite often people would wonder what the source is. One has to understand the source is another human being, a person, and he has to develop a relationship with the person to get that exclusivity in the news operations. And this is what one of the most difficult part in the life of a journalist is, because a journalist does not create the news, nor he is supposed to create the news. If he does it, that means he is doing something really very unethical.
One event being reported by all the media organizations, so stories different news organizations, because journalist has different sources.
Absolutely.
So that's where exclusive becomes the
That
picture.
is what gives a different color and a very, what is called, exclusive color.
And where there is a competition, which is a better coverage.
Yes, that is what the challenge to the journalist is, that whatever is happening is something very common for everyone, but even within that commonality, he has to bring out which is very different.
Something different, yes.
And here, what comes as a complex operation is dealing with a human being, because one of the most difficult part of a human psychology is no human being wants to part with the information. Quite often people feel that even after right to information and all that,
There are some motives.
absolutely, either a motive has to be given or a motive has to be created.
There is a motive to reveal, there is a motive to
Yes.
conceal.
When I was actually cub reporter, my journalism teacher, he was of course a journalist, a fine journalist, he said, you see, news has to be pumped out of the belly of a person. So how do you pump that out? That is important. He has to be goaded, he has to be persuaded, he has to be cajoled to part with that information. And that is where the handling of the source becomes extremely important. How you handle the source. Because a source can't be handled like an inanimate object. It's a live object. It has its own mind.
It has to be cultivated over a
It has
period of time.
to be cultivated. It has to be dealt in a manner that whatever he has, he proffers to give it, and it gives it willfully. So that is where the difficult part is. Now the question is, you have said something very good, how to cultivate a source. Now this is one of the most difficult part, how to cultivate a source. Because most people have a tendency of not talking to people. But a journalist can't afford to do that. He has to talk to as many people as possible. If he doesn't have that acumen, that adaptability, that ability to talk to different people, then he possibly is not cut out for this particular profession. So how does he do that? How does he cultivate the source? First he has to study his own beat. What he has to cover today. Now suppose he is covering the police, whether he is covering parliament or ministry or any other department or local body or any association like say Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce or Confederation of Indian Industry or maybe any scientific
Well, beat is, that means the area of reporting for a journalist. One area is assigned to every journalist, that's called his beat.
Absolutely, you are very right.
Just we know
Absolutely, yes, they must understand that beat is every journalist.
Like beat constable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like a beat constable. Every journalist is a beat journalist. He has to deal with a particular area, and there he also has to specialize. And in that process of specialization, also these sources, which are also called contacts, are extremely useful. So, in a particular area, in a particular beat, one would find that there are a number of persons in any department are all functioning. Now, how to find out the right person? That becomes the first question for a journalist. Now, quite often, any new...
So one is he must have a variety of sources, and then second challenge is that how to pick up source for one particular information.
One particular information, that is what he has to do. You see, in any organization there would be a front man. That is the spokesman of an organization, a spokesman of a department. So he must know the spokesman.
And he is trained to deal with the media also.
He is trained to deal with the media, and but he has to, a journalist has to be very careful because he is also trained to mislead the journalist.
Yes.
So that is where a spokesperson also becomes a tricky person. So what a journalist should do? He also has to find out within the same ministry or department parallel persons who also have lots of information, perhaps more information than the spokesperson. So he has to dot on them, and with the dotting he has to develop a relationship with those persons.
So going beyond that means the official person is authorized to reveal the information.
Absolutely.
Going beyond that is the most important.
Absolutely, that is most important. You have to go beyond the official person to know what exactly is happening. Because the official person is supposed to reveal only as much he has been told.
Whatever he is assigned to do.
He has been assigned to do. And that is also true of whether it is a political party, whether it is a government department, whether it is a police department or anywhere.
So we can say that official spokespersons are not a source of exclusive news. By and large, you can say broadly.
By and large, they are not, but it depends.
It depends, yes.
Because if you can develop that kind of relationship, many a times it has also been found that the same official spokesman gives some special information to some journalist but not to others. That is
Because perhaps they have cultivated that source.
cultivated that. Absolutely. The cultivating the source is extremely important. How you cultivate it, how you become close to that person, how you enjoy his confidence. Enjoying the confidence, developing that confidence is extremely important. So, behind the scenes, these persons who have intimate information, they become very important also. And they can really spice up the story, the stories that one tries to look for and say that particular newspaper or particular news channel had given something very different, and that comes because of these part of the contact. Another important aspect in dealing with the sources, one should not consider anybody as insignificant. Everybody is very significant, even the peon or maybe a driver. If he is a driver of, say, police official, an investigative official, the driver, if you have developed that relationship, you can give lots of information that others may not have access to.
This driver can inform you that what are the movements of a politician, where he has gone, which people he
Everything you
visited.
can do.
Yes.
I will just give you an interesting information. This was in early 1970s. In Lucknow, there has been almost a scandal which is called the Sujata Varuna scandal. And her father, who was an IAS official, had shot her because of some association with some unwanted people. And the way it was being investigated, only one particular newspaper was reporting it and almost religiously giving every details of it. And nobody was able to find out how he was doing that, how that reporter was doing it. Because in the perception of the local reporters, he was a very junior person and he was not supposed to know all those details, but all that information that he was giving was virtually shaking not the journalist community itself, but also the powers that be at that time. Now, how did he do it? What he had done, he had befriended the driver of the city SP, and he was giving him all the information where this man was going, where he was going, whom he was meeting, all that. And rest of the things, of course, he was trying to do and find out and making up the story.
Then he was approaching these sources and
Approaching
getting
these sources
information.
and information. So, anybody can be an important part of that element to give one important aspect of the story. So now, in this particular process of developing contact, one has to be very careful also, because one should not be guided even by the habits of other newspapers. One has to develop the process himself. Because if one does it, one tries to follow somebody else's, possibly he may not have that acumen. Number two, he may even be misguided. Even journalists misguide journalists. Possibly you should know that.
Yes.
Now, once you have developed that contact, once you have developed that level of relationship with different persons, now what do you do with it? That is important aspect. You have to maintain it. Maintaining the contact is very important. How do you maintain it? For maintaining, a journalist should not just depend, as it has happened nowadays, that everybody has a mobile and he puts the numbers on the mobile and then he forgets that he needs to look after anything. But mobile, storing some information mobile is fine, but it is not always dependable. So one must maintain a diary as in the old style, and there the phone numbers of his contact, addresses, and another important aspect is everybody nowadays has a private mobile number also. Besides, there would also be some private official numbers also, landline numbers. So those numbers also he should try to store in it. But the caution is, since these numbers, these informations are passed in confidence to that journalist, one should never pass on such information to anybody else, even to his fellow colleagues or even to his editor.
Confidence has to be maintained.
Confidence has to be maintained with the contact. That is an important aspect. Now, this is one aspect that one can maintain the contact, but beyond that, it is necessary to know the contact.
You just indicated that at times journalists can be taken for a ride by the source.
Absolutely.
Now, I think that another question is that when information being shared with a journalist, how a journalist should evaluate the information in context of
This is
the
a very good
source.
question you have raised, actually.
Why something is being revealed?
Absolutely.
Because there are always some motivations behind revealing some information.
Absolutely. No, there are two ways some information is revealed. One is mandated by the law. Suppose a railway accident has happened. So railways are mandated by the law to release that information to the press. So that can be one level. The other can be a tendencies bed to share some information with a particular purpose. So whether that purpose is there or not, whether that news that is being shared, the information that is being shared is actually news or not, a journalist needs to evaluate that. And here again, the source becomes an important element, because when teaching basic reporting, one is told to check and cross-check. So checking and cross-checking, who do you check and who do you cross-check? That is very important. So cross-checking and checking also has to be done at different levels of sources. That means, suppose a source A, maybe the spokesman of an organization, reveals something, reveals some information, tries to disseminate some information, that should not be taken exactly on its face value. No information that is shared with a journalist should be taken on the face value of it. One needs to go beyond it and check whether the information that is being shared is actually with the view to help the public, or to misguide the public, or to cover up something from the public. And all these things can be checked if a journalist is industrious with different levels of sources. That is why I've told the students in the beginning that a journalist should have a parallel number of sources within the organization, because no one person would reveal all that has happened. There will be different persons working at different levels, they would have different kinds of information, and the journalist has to find out and tally all the information that is coming out, and with that then he has to evaluate what is the exact quality of the news.
So variety and multiplicity of the sources is required.
Multiplicity of the sources required to evaluate the quality of the news.
Quality of information also.
Quality of information. That is one very important aspect. Now let us, in this process, how we can do it. I said one must know the contact. Because you see, once you develop a contact, he almost becomes like a friend. That is what one has to do it. And sometimes such associations become lifelong. So what one needs to do? Not only one has to know his name, but he also has to know how he particularly spells it out. Because every person is very touchy about the way he writes his name. If somebody is writing his name, say his name is Ram, and quite often people would write R-A-M, but possibly he wants to write with R-A-A-M. And if somebody doesn't do that, he would feel hurt, offended. So, while spelling out a name, whether on a television screen, or in print, or in radio, one has to understand how also it pronounces it. Because if you pronounce it differently, again you can offend him.
Yes.
So one should know that particular aspect. Then one must also try to know what is his background. Now one would ask what one has to do with the background of the person, of the source. Well, background means one must know about his parents, about his schooling, about his previous jobs, about his habits, about his hobbies. Now, it looks very innocuous.
Only then you can cultivate and maintain.
It looks very innocuous that one should know all that.
No, that's important, I think.
That's very important. Really, that is very important.
How you cultivate it.
Yeah, because then you know possibly that he is possibly also from your alma mater, from your own university, from your own school or own college. So again, that creates a different kind of a bond.
Or at times, the discussion may be initiated in informal manner.
Absolutely.
You
That is
come
what
from that
you see.
district
The
and that
basic aspect is, now if you have somebody is interested in swimming and you have also an interest in swimming, so it becomes a gelling point and relationship gets stronger. Now the issue is, the basic thing is journalist must also be a good talker, so that he can engage his sources in conversation. Because what a journalist talks during the day, possibly only 10% of it will turn out to be news. But if he doesn't do that extra 90% of talking, the source would not reveal what
cannot be
is
achieved.
10%
Yes.
cannot be achieved.
There is no shortcut.
No shortcut in journalism. In journalism, quite often we say that you invest a lot of time. My father would have said, you waste a lot of time.
90% you waste.
90% you waste,
10% you
or you can say 90% you invest, and to get 10% out of it.
Return, yes.
So that is where how you develop the contact. That is how you develop.
It's time and information also, I think so, because
time,
that kind of amount of information that is collected,
Absolutely.
maybe only
Absolutely.
10% of that will make the news.
Absolutely. And in this process, what is required also is that the contact or the source also should know you. Because it is said in psychological terms that only a frightened person does not want that he should be known to others. So here he also has to share all that he is to the source, because the question is, you have to develop a kind of a bond.
So if you want to use a source within quote, use. So a
Of
source will
course.
also be using you.
Source also must be using you. You have to be prepared for that. And what you said, the source must be using you. In fact, what happens is, in many news developments, what happens is, in many organizations, he may be an official spokesman or an important source for you. He may not be knowing exactly what is happening within his organization. The information may be coming to you. So in that case, number one, for the check of purpose of cross-checking. Number two, just to give him a feedback, so that source also feel obliged that if something is happening within his area, you are tipping him off.
Yes.
So that
Serving
also,
mutual interest.
serving
yes.
mutual interest, you can say, that is very important. So these are some of the very important aspects that one needs to take care of, that one.
So feedback means when you are getting some useful information from a source, you are also giving him back some useful information.
Absolutely.
That's useful for
Absolutely,
for that source.
that is a very important important aspect. But a caution is, quite often journalists, what they do, they commit one mistake, that quite often they take the source also for being granted. That means they feel they can walk into his office or residence whenever they like. One has to understand the source is a busy person. He is an important person. He holds a position in society in his office. So if somebody can check the information at some lower level, he need not always disturb the source also. So some privacy of the source also needs to be maintained. But that also doesn't mean that one should not show his face at all. One has to show his face as often as possible, but taking care that whenever it is necessary, you must show the face, because if you don't do it, the source may forget you. So this also should
It's a
not.
continuous interaction with the source.
Continuity is an
To maintain
important,
certain amount of faith also.
absolutely,
Yes.
continuity is an important aspect in the source. So you must maintain the relationship. And
Kind of a
physical presence,
live relationship,
just
yes.
sometimes you can do telephoning, but telephoning always doesn't help. So you must show yourself in person now. Another aspect is you must have faith in the source. That means whatever the source is sharing with you in confidence, you are not supposed to breach that confidence. That means if he says, this is not for print, this is off the record,
Just off the record.
then honor him. Don't print it. Maybe after a few days, he will give you much better and important information. But there are two things about this off the
The
record.
trust is breached, then source is destroyed.
Trust is breached, and source will never try to talk to you.
And even other sources may get suspicious of you.
Absolutely.
If you destroy one source, that may
Absolutely.
result in destroying so many sources.
Yes, yes. Once you destroy one source, that means you have
Your
destroyed
credibility
many
is
other
gone.
sources,
Your
and you have
credibility.
lost your credibility.
Credibility.
So one journalist should not try to lose that. But there are off the record of two kinds. There are one off the record, which means it is off the print or off the air. It must not be reported.
In
There
any
are-
form.
In any
It
form.
cannot be used.
It can't be used. Information
Yes.
can't be used. There is another kind of off the record.
That's only for reference.
This is on.
Only for
The second kind of off the record is that you can use the information, but don't report from where you have got it. That is, you should not
Should not
report
be
the
identified as source.
source should not be
Be
identified. But you can inform, you can use the information maybe as a background information, or as maybe even as an important news information. But the caution is the source must not be identified.
We should
in this
protect it,
particular
yes.
source must be
So
protected.
that's why the phrase are used, official sources, informed sources, highly placed sources.
These words are often
To
used,
protect the
but
identity of the
sometimes,
source.
I would give a caution that when you use these words also, you indirectly identify
Indicative,
the
it
source. So
will become indicative.
if you can identify these indicative words also, it would be perhaps better, because a reader also has trust in the journalist that whatever he is giving on some authenticity,
Yes.
and naturally on the basis of a source. So if he doesn't mention that, it won't harm the story. And another caution is, never tell one source what the other source has told you. That means there has to be complete confidentiality between the sources, and the sources must not be made to fight with each other.
For example, if you are doing political reporting and getting some information from such source, that should not be given to some other politician, that he might use it. That's
Absolutely.
it.
That he might either use it,
Use it.
or it may even hurt you as a journalist, because again, finally what would happen is you will be closing down your own sources. So one should not try to close down the sources. One should try to make use of the maximum use of the sources to generate the maximum information that is possible, so that he can disseminate with the people, disseminate with the readers, the viewers, and that is an important aspect.
So a press briefing, because you mentioned the off the record and on the record source information, there are some briefings also, press briefings are conducted.
Yes.
So they are both categories, off the record briefing and on the record briefing.
Yes, quite often even political parties have mastered in doing that. One, of course, is done before the camera, or just they are reported that this is the news item, this is what the political party has done. But immediately after that, what they do is kind of a debriefing session, where the same person try to give a detailed account of how the operations have taken place. And these debriefing sessions are very important, because here the source virtually does a post-mortem or analysis of the entire operation.
So there are, as Professor Sarkar explained, the three categories of information that a journalist gets. One is on the record information, where the source can be identified, can be named, information can be shared. Second category is off the record information that a journalist gets. And there are two categories within that. One category is that where information cannot be used at all. And second category is where information can be used but source should not be revealed, source should not be identified, and a care has to be taken to protect the source. And that's extremely important, that the entire news operations are dependent on the sources. your report is rich and exclusive when you have a different kind of sources. So a journalist has to maintain variety and multiplicity of sources to get real news story. So with that, we'll conclude the session. Thank you very much, Professor
Thank
Sarkar.
you, Professor Dhuria.